October 1978. A small mountain town in Colorado where everyone knew everyone else's business. The kind of place where leaving your door unlocked wasn't unusual, and the local diner served as the unofficial community center. 23-year-old Rebecca worked the evening shift at that diner. She'd been there since high school, serving coffee and pie to the same faces day after day. Her blonde hair was always tied back in a ponytail, and she had this way of remembering exactly how each regular customer liked their coffee. The older folks loved her. She was polite, hard-working, and never complained about the long hours. But Rebecca had dreams that stretched far beyond the mountain town. She'd pin up photos of Denver on the wall of her tiny apartment. The big city lights, the possibilities, a chance to be someone other than just the waitress at Joe's diner. She'd been saving money, little by little tucking away tips in an old shoebox under her bed. Her boyfriend, David, didn't like hearing about those dreams. He'd grown up in this town and he planned to die here too. The idea of Rebecca leaving made him angry. Really angry. They'd been together for 3 years and lately things had gotten tense. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. She seemed quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes she'd show up with her sweater pulled high on her neck, even on warm days. October 15th was a Tuesday. Rebecca worked the evening shift like always. The dinner rush came and went. By 9 o'clock, only a handful of customers remained. Old Mr. Peterson sat at the counter, nursing his third cup of coffee and doing a crossword puzzle. A young couple shared a milkshake in the corner booth. Linda, the other waitress on duty, remembered Rebecca seeming distracted that night. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall. When Linda asked if everything was okay, Rebecca just smiled and said she was tired. But Linda could tell something was bothering her friend. Around 10:30, Rebecca started her closing duties. She wiped down tables, refilled salt shakers, and swept the floors. Joe, the owner, counted the register and told both girls they could head home. Linda left first, waving goodbye as she walked to her car parked right outside. Rebecca stayed behind for a few extra minutes. She needed to finish restocking the napkin holders. Joe locked up the front door and left through the back entrance, assuming Rebecca would lock up behind herself like she'd done 100 times before. That was the last time anyone saw Rebecca alive. When she didn't show up for her morning shift the next day, Joe wasn't too worried at first. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she'd overslept. But when she didn't answer her phone, he started to feel uneasy. Rebecca was reliable. She always called if she couldn't make it to work. By Thursday morning, Joe drove to Rebecca's apartment. He knocked on the door, no answer. Her car wasn't in the parking lot. He peeked through the window and everything looked normal inside. He called her mother, who lived 2 towns over. She hadn't heard from her daughter either, and now she was getting worried too. That afternoon, Rebecca's mother filed a missing person report with the local police. The small department only had 5 officers, and missing person cases weren't exactly common in their quiet town. Deputy Wilson took the report and promised they'd look into it right away. The police talked to David first. He lived closest to Rebecca and was her boyfriend. David told them they'd had a fight on Monday night, the day before she disappeared. He said Rebecca had been talking about leaving town, about starting fresh somewhere new. He admitted he'd gotten angry, that they'd argued for over an hour, but he swore he'd gone home after that and never saw her again. David said he'd been at the auto repair shop where he worked all day Tuesday. His boss confirmed this. David had clocked in at 8 in the morning and didn't leave until 10 at night. He'd been working on a difficult engine problem and several people had seen him there throughout the day. On Friday, 3 days after Rebecca disappeared, a highway patrol officer found her car. It was parked at a rest stop 50 miles east of town, sitting in the far corner of the lot. The doors were unlocked. Her purse sat on the passenger seat with her wallet still inside. Her work uniform hung on a hanger in the back seat. Nothing seemed disturbed or stolen. The discovery of the car changed everything. To the police, it looked like Rebecca had planned to leave. Why else would her car be so far from home? Why would her work uniform be there? As if she'd never planned to return to her job, detectives searched her apartment with her mother's permission. Some of her clothes were missing. Her toothbrush was gone. A framed photo of her grandmother that usually sat on her nightstand had vanished. But strangest of all, they found the shoebox under her bed. It was empty, all her savings gone. The evidence seemed clear to investigators. Rebecca had run away. She'd taken her money, some clothes, and left town. Maybe she'd hitchhiked from that rest stop. Maybe someone had picked her up and driven her to Denver or beyond. Young women did this sometimes, they reasoned. Especially ones in difficult relationships, ones who felt trapped in small towns with no future. Linda didn't believe it. She told police that Rebecca would never just leave without saying goodbye. They'd been friends since middle school. They'd shared secrets, dreams, fears. Rebecca would have told her if she was planning something like this. Rebecca's mother refused to believe it too. She knew her daughter. Yes, Rebecca wanted to leave town someday, but she was a planner. She would have done it the right way. She wouldn't just vanish in the middle of the night without a word to anyone. But as weeks turned into months, the police stopped actively investigating. They'd checked hospitals, morgues, and homeless shelters in nearby cities. Nothing. They'd interviewed everyone who knew Rebecca. No new leads emerged. The file was marked as a probable runaway and placed in a cabinet drawer. The local newspaper ran a small article about the missing waitress. Rebecca's photo stared out from page 5. Beneath a headline that read, "Local woman disappears. Police suspect voluntary departure." The article mentioned her troubled relationship and her dreams of leaving town. It painted a picture of a young woman who'd simply had enough and walked away from her old life. In the diner, people whispered. Some felt sorry for her mother. Others said Rebecca was selfish for not even calling to let people know she was safe. A few wondered if something darker had happened, but those voices were quiet and mostly ignored. David moved away 6 months later. He told people the memories were too painful. He needed a fresh start somewhere else, away from all the questions and suspicious looks. And just like that, Rebecca became a story people told. A cautionary tale, a mystery without an answer. The girl who everyone thought ran away in 1978, but she hadn't run away at all. The diner stayed open, but it felt different after Rebecca disappeared. For months, customers would glance at the spot where she used to stand, taking orders with that bright smile of hers. Linda kept working there, but she never stopped wondering what really happened to her friend. Every time the door chimed, she'd look up, half expecting to see Rebecca walk in with some wild story about where she'd been, but Rebecca never came back. By 1980, most people had stopped talking about her. Life moved on the way it always does in small towns. New gossip replaced old mysteries. The hardware store owner ran off with the librarian. The mayor's son got arrested for drunk driving. Rebecca's story became just another piece of local history, something people might mention once in a while. When the conversation turned to strange happenings, Joe's Diner eventually closed down in 1985. Joe retired and moved to Arizona to be near his grandkids. The building sat empty for a year before someone bought it and turned it into a pizza place. Then it became a Chinese restaurant. By the 2000s, it was a cell phone store. Nobody working there knew that a missing waitress used to serve coffee in that exact spot decades earlier. Rebecca's mother never gave up hope. She kept her daughter's room exactly the way it was, like a shrine frozen in time. The posters on the walls, the books on the shelf, the stuffed animals from childhood lined up on the bed. Every year on Rebecca's birthday, her mother would bake a chocolate cake, her daughter's favorite, and sit alone at the kitchen table with tears running down her face. She hired a private investigator in 1982, spending money she didn't really have. The investigator looked through everything again, interviewed people, checked records in other states. He found nothing new, just the same dead ends the police had hit. He told her honestly that Rebecca had probably started a new life somewhere under a different name. It happened more often than people thought, he said. Especially back then, before computers made it harder to disappear. Rebecca's mother refused to believe it. She'd spend hours at the library, going through newspapers from other cities looking for any mention of an unidentified woman who might be her daughter. She'd call police departments in different states, asking if they had any Jane Does matching Rebecca's description. The answer was always no, or worse, yes, but the woman turned out to be someone else. In 1989, Rebecca's mother passed away from a heart attack. The doctor said it was natural causes, but everyone who knew her understood she'd died from a broken heart. 11 years of wondering, hoping, and searching had worn her down to nothing. Linda attended the funeral. Only a handful of people showed up. Most folks who'd known Rebecca had either moved away or forgotten about her by then. The case file sat in a storage room at the police station, gathering dust. New deputies came and went. The older officers who'd worked on Rebecca's case retired. Deputy Wilson, who'd taken the initial missing person report, died in 1995. With him went the last real connection to that October night in 1978. The town itself changed too. The main highway got rerouted in 1992, bringing more traffic and more businesses. A Walmart opened up on the edge of town. Fast food restaurants appeared. The population grew from 3,000 to almost 8,000. New families moved in, people who'd never heard of Rebecca or her disappearance. By 2000, the internet made the world smaller. True crime forums started popping up online, and someone eventually posted about Rebecca's case. Amateur detectives from across the country weighed in with their theories. Some thought David had killed her despite his alibi. Others believed she'd been picked up by a serial killer hitchhiking from that rest stop. A few insisted she was living happily somewhere with a new identity, maybe with kids of her own by now. The most popular theory remained the simplest one. Rebecca had wanted out of her life, and she'd taken it. She'd planned her escape carefully, taken her money, and vanished. The fact that nobody ever heard from her again just meant she'd been really committed to leaving everything behind. Some people do that, the internet sleuth said. They reinvent themselves completely. Cut all ties. Start over. Linda, now in her 60s and long retired from waitressing, would sometimes read these online discussions. She'd created an account once and tried to explain that Rebecca wasn't that kind of person, that she was loyal and loving and would never hurt her mother like that. But the internet strangers didn't know Rebecca. They only knew the story, the facts on paper. And on paper, it looked like a runaway case. The rest stop where Rebecca's car had been found got rebuilt in 2005. The old parking lot was torn up and expanded. Modern facilities replaced the tiny bathrooms from the 70s. Security cameras were installed. Not that it mattered for a decades-old case, but the world had changed. It was harder to disappear now. In 2015, a journalism student from Denver State University chose Rebecca's case for her senior project. She drove to the mountain town, interviewed old-timers, and dug through archived newspapers at the library. She even found Linda and spent an afternoon listening to stories about Rebecca. The student wrote a compelling article suggesting that maybe the case deserved another look. Maybe the police had been too quick to label it a runaway situation. The article got published in the university newspaper and then picked up by a true crime blog. For a few weeks, Rebecca's story circulated online again. People shared it, commented on it, debated what really happened. Then, like always, it faded away. The internet moved on to fresher mysteries, newer disappearances. By 2020, almost nobody in town remembered Rebecca anymore. The older generation had mostly passed away or moved to retirement homes. The younger people had their own lives, their own problems. They didn't know about the waitress who'd vanished 42 years earlier. Why would they? Linda was one of the last people left who truly remembered. She was 78 now, living in a small house on the edge of town. Sometimes she'd drive past where the old diner used to be and feel this ache in her chest. She'd think about her friend with the blonde ponytail and the dreams of Denver. She'd wonder where Rebecca's body was buried, because Linda had never believed the runaway story, not for a single day in 40-plus years. She just knew deep in her bones that something terrible had happened to Rebecca that October night. And whoever had done it had gotten away with it because everyone else had been too willing to believe the easy explanation. The mountains kept their secrets well. The forests were deep and vast, full of places where a person could be hidden forever. Animals, weather, and time could erase evidence completely. If Rebecca was out there somewhere, buried under leaves and soil, she might never be found. That's what Linda had resigned herself to believing. The truth would die with her generation. Rebecca would remain a mystery forever, her fate unknown, her story unfinished. But sometimes the earth itself decides to tell secrets it's been keeping. Sometimes nature has a way of revealing what's been buried for far too long, and that's exactly what was about to happen. March 2023. The weather forecast had been warning about it for days. A massive storm system was moving in from the Pacific, bringing with it more rain than the Colorado mountains had seen in decades. Meteorologists called it a once-in-a-century event, the kind of storm that changes landscapes and makes history. The rain started on a Tuesday morning and didn't stop. It came down in sheets, turning roads into rivers and overwhelming drainage systems that were never built to handle this much water. The town issued evacuation orders for low-lying areas. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered their windows and doors. By Thursday, the mountain slopes were saturated. The ground couldn't absorb any more water. Trees that had stood for 100 years suddenly had no purchase in the mud. Creek beds that normally trickled now roared with brown, churning water, carrying everything in their path. Old Mountain Road had always been a problem area. It wound up the mountainside, connecting the town to some newer developments built in the early 2000s. The road followed the natural contours of the slope, with steep drops on one side and hillside on the other. Engineers had reinforced parts of it over the years, but nature always finds the weak spots. On Friday morning, just after dawn, a section of that hillside gave way. Thousands of tons of mud, rock, and debris came sliding down, taking trees and boulders with it. The landslide was so powerful it shook houses a quarter-mile away. It completely buried a 100-foot section of Old Mountain Road under 12 feet of earth and rubble. By Saturday, the rain had finally stopped. The sun came out for the first time in 5 days, revealing the damage. The town looked like it had been through a war. Flooding had destroyed dozens of homes. Roads were washed out. Power lines were down. But the landslide on Old Mountain Road was the biggest concern because it cut off access to 300 homes in the hills above. The county brought in a construction crew to start clearing the debris. They needed to get that road open as soon as possible. People needed to get to work, kids needed to get to school, and emergency vehicles needed access to those neighborhoods. Carlos had been running heavy equipment for 20 years. He'd cleared landslides before, but this one was massive. He climbed into his excavator Monday morning, preparing for what he knew would be days of careful, exhausting work. The bucket of his machine could move a ton of earth at a time, but he had to work slowly. Power lines, water pipes, and gas lines ran under that road. One wrong move could cause an explosion or leave hundreds of people without utilities. By Tuesday afternoon, Carlos had moved about a third of the debris. The work was mind-numbing. Scoop, lift, dump. Scoop, lift, dump. His back ached and his eyes were tired from staring at nothing but mud and rocks for hours. Then something caught his eye, a flash of color in the brown earth. Blue maybe, or purple. Something that didn't belong in a pile of mud and stone. Carlos stopped the excavator and climbed down to take a closer look. His boots sank into the soft ground as he walked over to where he'd seen the color. He crouched down and brushed away some loose dirt. Fabric. Old fabric. Faded and stained, but definitely clothing. His heart started beating faster. It could be nothing. Maybe someone had buried old clothes up here decades ago. People dumped all kinds of things in the woods, but then he saw something else. Something white and smooth, partially exposed in the earth. Carlos had hunted deer his whole life. He knew bones when he saw them. And these bones were too big, too long to be from any animal he'd ever seen. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his cell phone and called his supervisor. Within an hour, the construction site was closed down. Yellow tape surrounded the area. Police cars blocked both ends of the road, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun. Detective Patricia Harris had been with the department for 15 years. She'd worked on murders, missing persons, and every kind of case in between. But when she got the call about possible human remains found in a landslide, she felt that familiar mix of dread and purpose that came with these situations. She arrived at the scene with the county medical examiner, Dr. Robert Chen. They suited up in protective gear and carefully approached the area Carlos had marked off. The construction worker stood off to the side, still looking shaken. Finding a body wasn't something you just shook off, even when you were expecting it might happen. Patricia knelt down next to the exposed earth. She could see what Carlos had seen. Fabric that had once been clothing. The unmistakable shape of human bones partially uncovered by the landslide. This wasn't a fresh burial. Whatever had happened here, it had happened a long time ago. Over the next 3 days, a forensic team carefully excavated the area. They worked slowly, documenting everything, taking hundreds of photographs. The rain had done most of the work for them, exposing the remains after decades of being hidden under feet of earth and vegetation. They found a complete skeleton. The bones were brown with age but remarkably well preserved. The cold mountain climate and the clay-rich soil had protected them. Scraps of clothing still clung to the remains. A jacket, jeans, boots that had somehow stayed intact. And then they found the wallet. It was leather, old and water-damaged, but still recognizable. Dr. Chen carefully opened it with gloved hands. Inside was a driver's license, the photo faded but still visible. A young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile. The name on the license made Patricia's blood run cold. Rebecca Thompson. Date of birth, April 7, 1955. License issued, 1977. Patricia had been only 10 years old in 1978, but she'd grown up in this town. She'd heard the stories about the waitress who'd disappeared. The girl everyone thought had run away to start a new life somewhere else. Her mother had even known Rebecca's mother, had attended her funeral back in the 80s. Patricia stood up and looked around at the landscape. They were on Old Mountain Road, just 2 miles from where Rebecca's car had been found 45 years ago. Back in 1978, this area would have been much more remote. Thick forest, no houses, just logging roads that barely anyone used. This wasn't where someone would end up by accident. This was where someone had been brought. Someone had dug a grave here, buried Rebecca, and let the whole world believe she'd run away. The news hit the town like a bomb. By that evening, every local news station was reporting it. The waitress who disappeared in 1978 had been found. She'd never run away. She'd been murdered and buried in the mountains just miles from home. Linda was watching the evening news when the story broke. She was sitting in her living room, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, when Rebecca's picture appeared on the screen. That driver's license photo from 1977, the one that had been in all the missing person reports back in the day. The teacup slipped from Linda's hand and shattered on the floor. She didn't notice. She was crying, tears streaming down her face as the reporter explained what had been found. After 45 years, her friend could finally come home. After 45 years, everyone would know that Linda had been right all along. Rebecca hadn't abandoned anyone. Someone had taken her life and stolen her future, and whoever had done it had let an innocent woman's mother die believing her daughter had chosen to disappear. Now the question was simple but haunting. Who had killed Rebecca? And could they still be caught after all these years? The forensic lab in Denver worked around the clock. Dr. Chen had sent Rebecca's remains there for a complete analysis. Within 48 hours, they had confirmation from dental records. The skeleton found on Old Mountain Road was definitely Rebecca Thompson. After that, the question everyone wanted answered was simple. How did she die? The medical examiner's report came back on Thursday. Patricia read it twice, her jaw tightening with each pass. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The injury was severe, a fracture that would have either killed Rebecca instantly or left her unconscious and dying. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall. Someone had struck her from behind with enough force to crush bone. The manner of death was officially ruled a homicide. Rebecca had been murdered. Patricia pulled the old case file from 1978. It was thick with witness statements, police reports, and photographs. She spread everything across the conference room table and started reading. She needed to see this case with fresh eyes, knowing what she knew now. The first person she looked at was David, Rebecca's boyfriend. Back in 1978, he'd been 25 years old, working at an auto repair shop. The police had questioned him extensively. He'd admitted to fighting with Rebecca the night before she disappeared, but he had an alibi for the day she vanished. He'd been at work from 8 in the morning until 10 at night, working on a customer's engine. Patricia called the detective who'd originally worked the case. He was 82 now, living in a retirement home in Boulder, but his memory was still sharp. "I never liked that boyfriend," the old detective told her over the phone. "Something about him rubbed me wrong. But his alibi checked out. His boss saw him. Coworkers saw him. He was there all day." "Did anyone actually watch him every single minute?" Patricia asked. There was a long pause.
"No, I mean people saw him throughout the day."
But it was a busy shop. People were coming and going. Could he have slipped out for an hour or two? Maybe. But where would he have gone? And how would he have gotten Rebecca up to that mountain? Those were good questions. Patricia pulled up DMV records from 1978. David had owned a truck back then, a blue Ford pickup. That was interesting. Old Mountain Road had been a logging route. You'd need a truck or a four-wheel drive vehicle to get up there, especially at night. But the timeline still didn't make sense. Rebecca had left the diner around 11 p.m. David's boss said he'd been at the shop until 10. Even if he'd left work, driven to find Rebecca, killed her, and buried her body, He would have needed hours. Someone would have noticed him missing from work for that long. Patricia decided to track David down. He'd moved away from Colorado in 1979, but DMV records showed he'd ended up in Phoenix, Arizona. He was 68 years old now, remarried with 3 grown children. He'd worked as a mechanic his whole life, retiring just last year. 2 detectives flew to Phoenix and showed up at David's house on a Tuesday morning. He answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, coffee mug in hand. When they showed him their badges and said they wanted to talk about Rebecca Thompson, his face went pale. They sat in his living room while his wife hovered nervously in the kitchen. David's hands shook as he held his coffee mug. He kept saying he'd told the police everything back in 1978. He hadn't seen Rebecca that night. He didn't know what happened to her. But you weren't surprised when we said we wanted to talk about her, one of the detectives pointed out. You'd heard she was found. David nodded slowly. It was all over the news. I saw it, I couldn't believe it. All these years I thought she'd run off somewhere. Started a new life. Did you kill her, David? No, God, no. I loved her. Yeah, we fought, but I never would have hurt her. They questioned him for 2 hours. His story hadn't changed in 45 years. He and Rebecca had argued on Monday night. She'd said she was leaving town. He'd gotten angry and said some things he regretted, but he'd gone home. The next day he went to work like normal. He never saw her again. The detectives asked about his truck. Did he still have it? David shook his head. I sold it in November of '78, got a different vehicle. Why, where did you sell it? To some guy. I don't remember his name. Put an ad in the paper and he came and bought it for cash. They let David go but told him not to leave the state. Back in Colorado, Patricia was digging deeper into the physical evidence. The forensic team had found something interesting embedded in Rebecca's skull fracture. Tiny paint chips. They'd sent them to a lab for analysis. The results came back 3 weeks later. The paint was from a vehicle, specifically a type used on Ford trucks in the mid to late '70s. The color was called bright blue. It matched the exact shade of David's truck from 1978. Patricia felt a surge of excitement. This was the connection they needed. But she had to be careful. The defense would argue that paint chips weren't enough. Lots of people owned blue Ford trucks back then. She started tracking down David's old truck. DMV records showed he'd sold it to a man named Robert Cooper in November 1978. Robert had owned it for 7 years before selling it to his nephew. The nephew had kept it until 1995 when he'd finally scrapped it. But Robert's nephew had been a truck enthusiast. He'd taken photos of every vehicle he'd ever owned. When Patricia called him, now a 58-year-old grandfather, he dug through boxes in his garage and found them. Old Polaroids from the '80s and '90s. One photo made Patricia's heart race. It showed the blue Ford truck from the front. And there, clear as day, was damage to the front bumper and hood. Dents and scratches that looked like impact damage. She showed the photo to a forensic specialist. Could this damage have been caused by striking a person? The specialist studied it carefully. Possibly, he said. The height and pattern are consistent with hitting something or someone at roughly head level. But I can't say for certain without examining the actual vehicle. Patricia knew the truck was long gone, crushed and recycled decades ago, but this was still good evidence. The paint chips, the photos, the timeline, it was all starting to come together. She went back through David's original alibi. His boss from 1978 had died in 2003, but she managed to track down 2 of David's former co-workers. Both were in their 70s now, but they remembered that October. One of them, a man named Frank, said something that changed everything. The shop was crazy busy that week. We had a backlog of work. David was stressed about it. I remember he took a long lunch break one day, maybe 2 hours. The boss wasn't happy about it, but David said he had personal business to take care of. Do you remember which day that was? Patricia asked. Frank thought for a moment. Tuesday, I think. Yeah, Tuesday. Because we had that big Cadillac job due Wednesday morning and David wasn't there to help. Tuesday. The day Rebecca disappeared. The day David said he'd been at work all day. Patricia flew back to Phoenix with an arrest warrant. When they knocked on David's door this time, he already knew why they were there. He'd hired a lawyer. He refused to answer questions, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who'd been carrying a terrible secret for 45 years. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The paint chips from his truck, the photos showing damage. his co-workers remembering him taking a long break on the day Rebecca died. The fact that he'd sold the truck just weeks after the murder. David was arrested and extradited back to Colorado. The charge is second-degree murder. The trial was set for 6 months later. The media descended on the small mountain town like locusts. Everyone wanted to know the story of the waitress found 45 years after she disappeared. But Patricia knew they didn't have everything yet. They had evidence, they had circumstantial connections, but they didn't have the truth. Not the whole truth. And somehow she needed to get David to tell them what really happened that October night in 1978. David sat in the interrogation room for the 3rd time that week. His lawyer sat beside him, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd told him repeatedly not to say anything. But Patricia could see the cracks forming. David looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled. His eyes were red and hollow. Patricia laid out the evidence piece by piece. The paint chips from his truck embedded in Rebecca's skull. The photographs showing damage to his vehicle. The co-workers who remembered him leaving work that Tuesday for hours. The fact that he'd sold the truck just weeks after Rebecca disappeared, like he was trying to get rid of evidence. "We know you did it, David," Patricia said quietly. "We have enough to convict you. But what we don't have is the why. We don't have your side of the story. And after 45 years, don't you think it's time to finally tell the truth?" David's lawyer put her hand on his arm, a clear signal to stay quiet. But David was looking at the photographs spread across the table. Photos of Rebecca from 1978, her driver's license picture, the remains found on the mountain, the life he'd taken away. "She was going to leave me," he said suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. "David, don't," his lawyer warned. But something had broken inside him. 45 years of carrying this secret had worn him down to nothing. He started talking, and once he started, he couldn't stop. He told them about Monday night, October 14th. They'd fought at Rebecca's apartment. She'd shown him the money she'd been saving, told him she was done with their relationship, done with this town. She had enough for a bus ticket to Denver and first month's rent somewhere. She was leaving by the end of the week. David had begged her to stay. Then he'd gotten angry. He'd grabbed her arm. She'd pushed him away and told him to leave. If he ever touched her like that again, she'd call the police. That's when he'd left, humiliated and furious. The next day at work, he couldn't concentrate. All he could think about was Rebecca leaving. The idea of her starting a new life without him made him crazy. During his lunch break, he decided to go talk to her, to apologize, to convince her to give him another chance. But Rebecca wasn't at her apartment. He drove to the diner, thinking maybe she'd picked up an extra shift. Joe told him she wasn't scheduled until the evening. So David went back to work, but he couldn't focus. He kept watching the clock. At 8 o'clock, he told his boss he had to leave for a family emergency. His boss wasn't happy, but he let him go. David drove straight to the diner. He parked down the street where Rebecca wouldn't see his truck. He waited. At 11:15, he watched her walk out the back door alone. The lights inside went off. She was locking up. He got out of his truck and called her name. Rebecca turned around, and when she saw him, her face changed. She looked afraid. She told him to leave her alone. She started walking fast toward her car. David followed her, still trying to talk, trying to explain. He reached for her arm, just wanting her to stop and listen, but Rebecca spun around and told him she was done. She'd already packed her things. She was leaving tomorrow. She never wanted to see him again. Something inside David snapped. He couldn't remember exactly what happened next. It was like watching himself from outside his own body. He'd grabbed a tire iron from his truck. He kept it there for changing flats. When Rebecca turned to walk away, he'd swung it. He didn't mean to. Or maybe he did. He couldn't even remember anymore. The sound of it hitting her skull was something that haunted him for 45 years. Rebecca had dropped like her legs had been cut out from under her. She didn't make a sound. She just fell, crumpling onto the pavement behind the diner. David had stood there in shock, the tire iron still in his hand, watching blood pool beneath her head. He'd checked for a pulse, nothing, she was gone. In one moment of rage, he'd destroyed everything, he'd panicked. He couldn't think straight. All he knew was that he had to hide what he'd done. He'd picked Rebecca up, she was so small, so light, and put her in the bed of his truck. He'd covered her with a tarp he kept back there. Then he'd gone back to her apartment. He knew where she kept her spare key. He'd let himself in and grabbed some of her clothes, her toothbrush, the money from under her bed. He'd taken the photo of her grandmother. He wanted it to look like she'd packed and left on her own. Then he'd driven her car to that rest stop 50 miles away. He'd left her purse and uniform in the car to make it look like she'd met someone there, someone who'd driven her away to start her new life. He'd hitchhiked back to town, getting picked up by a trucker who never knew what David had done. The hardest part came next. He'd driven up Old Mountain Road with Rebecca's body in the back of his truck. He'd found a spot far from the main road, hidden by trees. The ground was soft from recent rain. He'd dug for hours in the darkness, using a shovel from his truck. When the hole was deep enough, he'd buried her. He'd thrown the tire iron into a river on his way home. He'd washed his truck 3 times, scrubbing every inch of it, but he'd missed the paint chips that had transferred to her skull. He hadn't known about forensic evidence back then. He was just a scared 25-year-old kid who'd made the worst mistake of his life. For weeks afterward, he'd waited for someone to figure it out, but they never did. The police believed Rebecca had run away, just like he'd planned. And as the months went by, David started to believe maybe he'd gotten away with it, but he'd never really gotten away with anything. Every day for 45 years, he'd lived with what he'd done. He'd moved away, started over, built a new life. He'd married a good woman, raised children, became a grandfather. But Rebecca was always there, a ghost he couldn't escape. When he'd seen the news about her remains being found, he'd known it was over. Part of him felt relieved. The secret had been eating him alive for nearly half a century. By the time David finished talking, he was crying. His lawyer looked like she wanted to disappear. Patricia just sat there, taking it all in. This was the confession she'd needed, but hearing it didn't feel like victory. It just felt sad. 2 lives destroyed on the October night in 1978, all because a young man couldn't handle rejection. The trial was quick. With David's confession, there wasn't much to argue about. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution wasn't interested. This was murder, and the community wanted justice. David was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. At 68 years old, he'd likely die in prison. Linda attended every day of the trial. She was 79 now, using a cane to walk, but she needed to be there. She needed to hear David admit what he'd done. On the day of sentencing, she stood up in court and read a victim impact statement. She talked about Rebecca's dreams, her kindness, the life she'd never got to live. She talked about Rebecca's mother, who'd died believing her daughter had abandoned her. She talked about 45 years of wondering and hoping and never knowing. Her voice shook but never broke. "You didn't just kill Rebecca that night," Linda told David. "You killed her mother's hope. You killed the truth. You let everyone believe she'd run away, that she'd chosen to hurt everyone who loved her. You're not just guilty of murder, you're guilty of stealing her memory." 2 months later, Rebecca was finally laid to rest. They buried her next to her mother in the town cemetery. Linda was there, along with a few other people who'd known Rebecca. The journalism student who'd written about the case came. Even some people who'd never met Rebecca showed up, just to pay their respects to a life cut short. A small memorial was placed at the site where the old diner used to be. A simple plaque with Rebecca's name, her dates, and a single line: "She never ran away. She never gave up. She was taken from us." The story made national news for a while. News shows did special segments about the waitress whose truth had been buried for 45 years. True crime podcasts covered it extensively. For a few months, everyone knew Rebecca's name. Then, like always, the world moved on to other stories. But in that small mountain town, people remembered. They remembered that sometimes the easy explanation isn't the right one. They remembered that missing people deserve to be searched for, believed in, and never forgotten. And they remembered Rebecca Thompson, the young woman with dreams of Denver who never got the chance to chase them. The landslide hadn't just revealed her remains. It had revealed the truth, and sometimes, even after 45 years, the truth is exactly what's needed to finally bring someone home.